Hello, everyone. I'm Alfy, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first interview for my blog. I'm thrilled because my very first guest is Paul Edward Costa, who is one of the most prolific creative talents on the Canadian art scene. I personally met Paul through his constant and ceaseless efforts at promoting and hosting platforms and events for poets, musicians, and spoken word artists in the Greater Toronto area. A few of you know Paul Edward Costa as a poet, and that's a fair description of him. He did serve as the city of Mississaugas Poet Laureate from 2019 till 2021, and his poetry has been featured in numerous publications. But Paul's literary accomplishments aren't limited to poetry. Today, we'll have the chance to ask him about many things, including all his literary interests, as well as his latest book, Damned Avalon, published by Mosaic Press. Paul, it's great to have you on here.
Thank you so much for having me, Alfy. I appreciate it.
Perfect. So I'm going to start you out with a fairly typical question. What first got you into writing?
Yeah, I mainly got into it, I think, because of my interest in reading. As a kid, I was always a big reader, and I think that's seeing and appreciating the form in that way kind of got me more interested in it to the point of where I'd like to do it. When I was in high school and university, I was played in bands and did vocals and such. So it kind of started off as lyric writing, and the lyric writing kind of then evolved into poetry as I kind of became more interested in literature as my kind of medium. So it started off kind of from a lyric standpoint, and then it kind of grew past there. I was always interested in stories and fiction. I think I was more comfortable with poetry for a long time, but eventually I decided to try my hand at fiction. And I think with anything new that you try, there's often a kind of beginning period where you're finding your footing and things like that. And I knew that when I wanted to try going into doing fiction after doing poetry a long time, I knew that there was going to be that period at the beginning. So that probably made me avoid it for a bit. But once I did go into working on it more and practicing with it more, I kind of developed my own voice and what I knew I wanted to do, and kind of finding my own personality with that. So it started off, from lyric writing in bands, got into poetry. And then, when I got into doing spoken word a little later on, that also kind of, fueled the interest, of course. So it's something that it's always been in my life since, I was a teenager pretty much. It's been a way of expression that I've been very comfortable with, that suited me. Some people go to, dance or acting or painting, things like that. Due to circumstance and my past experiences, writing became the kind of thing that I was really interested in.
I see. So it was quite a journey from when you first started to Poet Laureate for the city of Mississauga. You served as the third Poet Laureate, correct?
Yeah, the initial term, it started April 2019. It was initially going to end April 2021. They have extended it a little bit just to August, because of the amount of things that were shut down or were canceled because of COVID. So a few initiatives that we're doing, we've refigured and retooled to do online this summer. So I'm still ending in 2021. It's just a couple months later than it once was. That's generally the 2-year plan.
Okay, so you're still the reigning Poet Laureate. That's awesome.
For a little bit, but we're actively getting into now looking for we'll be looking for the next one coming up soon. So I know that I'm doing some work soon to advertise that they're looking for the next position, and there'll be applications coming in soon.
Hey, you know what? Maybe I'll be one of the applications.
You very well might be. So I'm still there, but we're definitely in the transitioning phase for sure.
Perfect. So building a little on that, can you tell us a little about your duties as Mississauga's Poet Laureate? I mean, I know you were already involved in public literary pursuits beforehand, but tell us how much more of that was added to your life when you were selected for the position.
Yeah, I think my level of activity hasn't really changed, but it's more about the direction and where it's focused. I was, yes, obviously doing a lot of organizations of readings of poetry series and things like that, open mics beforehand. But this just kind of moved into more of city affiliated, or into more of a almost more of a mainstream sphere to a certain extent. So in terms of the duties, it also changes because every city runs it a little bit differently in terms of what they require and how they handle the program. Some it's more, we just pick a poet in the city and give them the title and that's it. But in Mississauga, you're a bit more involved in things and you're a bit closer to the heartbeat of that. So the main difference is that I was doing certain civic functions that I wasn't really part of before that. Things like Mayor's New Year's Levy, Remembrance Day, Canada Day, Robbie Burns Day, things like that. So I did work with, Mississauga libraries, workshops during April Poetry Month that I may not have done otherwise. I did, did certain event readings that I wasn't, part of before that. But also I kind of took the title to not just be the official requirements, like, these events, this initiative, that, whatever. I also kind of, applied it to a lot of things I did otherwise. So when I performed on my own, through my own volition and through my own kind of pursuits, I still tried to, keep that with me. So in terms of the duties that in Mississauga, there's those certain events that are more public city affiliated that you do stuff for, readings and poetry. Workshops with the library, doing things like Poetry Month in April is another common thing that you do. And I think all the Poets Laureate do a public works project as well. So I know that the guy before me did one on I think it's poetry on these steps near City Hall, a public installation of that. I'm working with an artist, Hiba Abdallah, and we're putting up panels along the Burnhamthorpe Trail that'll have poetry and designed work, artistic designs with them. And so there's also a public works project you do as well. And that kind of, the workshops, the readings at events, public works project, and a few other things that come up along the way. So occasionally, if different groups are putting on events in Mississauga or in central Mississauga, they might reach out to the city and say, hey, is the Poet Laureate available to speak at this thing? So sometimes the opportunities come in through there as well.
I see. So I actually did not know that the city of Mississauga honored the Robbie Burns Day. That's interesting to know.
Yeah, it was at the before COVID, of course. They did the reading at the Benares Historic House in Mississauga, which is an old, which is run by Mississauga Museums, and it's like a old style house that you do for like heritage and pioneer stuff. I did a live reading there for Robbie Burns Day, and then I did a online one to the library for Robbie Burns Day this year. There are some things that go on for that as well. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so when someone becomes a Poet Laureate, I imagine a few people think of them exclusively as poets and sort of sideline their other interests. Have you experienced a little of that? I'd like to know more about some of your other professional and creative endeavors.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it depends on how you can be a writer in various different ways or facets. It
Absolutely.
Depends on how you want to tackle it. There's multiple ways to wear that hat. I was mentioning to somebody recently that I almost prefer, I find the more accurate term would just be to say literary artist, as opposed to writer, poet, and all these other things. Because, I both teach about English, both in school and workshops. I write, poetry as well as fiction. Sometimes I've done nonfiction as well when required. So I generally view it as more of a general kind of literary practitioner, whether it's verbal, spoken word, page, poetry, written, promotion, or teaching. I almost view it like that. I've always had an interest in fiction because I think one of the things that made me, I said at the beginning that it was a love of reading that led me into writing. What drew me into reading was the ability that authors seem to have to create these whole worlds into which you could disappear, like Frank Herbert and Tolkien and all that stuff. Totally. And so that was always my interest in like prose, the way that, poetry creates a world, but prose can kind of really encapsulate the world in a different kind of way, for that matter. And So I've always been, along with poetry and fiction, it's always been a very kind of competing thing. There've been both elements of that. And so I've always still been interested in fiction, and that's something I've always done. I've published comparatively less of it than poetry, but it's also because with fiction, I find maybe it's a challenge that draws me to it, is that there's so many more moving parts. I find poetry, don't get me wrong, is detailed, intricate, all these things. But because of the inherent possibility for abstraction, you have a bit more leeway to play with. For prose, you have to, the dialogue has to work, the characters have to work, the plotting and the pacing has to work, the basic grammar and English structure has to work. There's just so many more things to kind of keep track of, and maybe the challenge is also it. So I think that a lot of people think of prose as like, hey, I write texts, I write emails, I can do prose. But I find it's a much more intricate and difficult thing to pull off and it looks really easy, of course, and you see it done well. Or maybe coming from a background of poetry, it's easier to overthink it and get too flowery. But I found it more challenging. And I've published comparatively less, but I still have published a good bit of it. So yeah, outside of poets, I still do fiction. But again, you can read fiction and prose in the world that seems very poetic and almost crosses that boundary. So,
That's true.
I'm also not sure. And you can go to narrative poems like, Beowulf or the Iliad and get like a prose quality in there. So that line isn't as strictly drawn as, some people may assume that it is. I've read, again, like I said, I've read prose that I'm like, damn, that basically is poetry. Because it's so eloquent and heartfelt and well constructed and things like that. So I do that, and also spoken word. But also spoken word has become attached to poetry at the hip more recently in the last few decades than maybe it once was, and that's also because of technology and ability. Now, I can make a spoken word performance, put it up, and it could be accessible to anybody in the world very quickly. If you were writing in the 1920s, the 1930s, your spoken word is only going to be seen by, if it's filmed, if it's distributed, or if somebody comes up and sees you. As a result, most of it happened in writing because that was how you could transmit. Now, I can transmit the live experience much easier. And if poets had that in the 1920s, 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, you might have had more people be more spoken word than purely page.
Absolutely. Yeah. It kind of changed the game a little bit.
Yeah. So technology, the medium kind of, obviously changes the message as we go.
So speaking of your other endeavors, fiction and such, let's discuss your latest book, Damned Avalon. It's a collection of flash fiction works, right? Are they tied to each other in any way or set in a common universe?
There are a couple, I think, in there that might use the same character, but generally they're not in the same universe. But they are meant to create a sort of a logical narrative flow. So, like for example, the first story just is first person and discusses a person talks about kind of coming to a realization and then entering on a kind of a journey, so it's a little bit about that. And then while the subsequent stories don't follow that character on the journey, it's more of a symbolic thing. So at the beginning in the first story, a character kind of has a realization, enters a place, and then at the end of the story, they kind of open a door and move through, and then you get a bunch of other stories. So it's not a strict literal connection, but there is a growth that kind of follows a logical sequence. So like the second story then, I believe deals more with like childhood and from a child's perspective. And so I tried to link them, in that kind of a way, where it follows the kind of natural progression that you can kind of follow. And the ending piece is almost made entirely of like footnotes. And the first line of the last story is like the last sentence of a story and then the end notes. So it's like a story where all you get is the last sentence and then notes. and you have to infer what was there beforehand. So like the last story uses end notes and has an ending vibe. And the disembodied narrator talks about, things being over. And the beginning story is about starting a journey. So it follows, that's the kind of sequence or the logic that I use to arrange the order of the pieces.
Chronological almost.
Yeah, to follow a certain, not a literal chronological, but a sort of hyper, like a figurative, chronological sequence.
A chronological connection as opposed to a chronological
order. Yeah.
Order. Yeah, got that. Okay. Speaking of childhood, then, would you say your career inspired any of the stories in the book as a teacher?
The pieces in the book were written largely between 2014. The earliest one was probably written around 2014, and the last one was written about a year ago. But a majority of them were written circa 2014 to 2017, 2016. I was teaching then. I don't think that teaching informed it. Not in a direct way. I think teaching has influenced my writing because I do thoroughly believe that I've learned more about writing in English from teaching it than I ever did on the receiving end of that, because I have to understand it to get that idea across to the students. And when I'm marking student work, I'm looking for common errors and mistakes and things that I fix. So the act of kind of like editing and correcting others' works is kind of made me more comfortable with certain and knowledgeable maybe about certain things with prose. So I think it influenced maybe stylistically, possibly. But the content itself wasn't particularly or directly inspired by teaching, but definitely the craft and the construction, I could say for sure, would have been altered if I had not been a teacher.
I can definitely see what you mean about teaching being more informative than learning when you're like learning to use language in that way. So I mean I understand the perspective because I've experienced it a few times teaching Arabic and English to like second language speakers. But I have to ask something else about the book that's kind of been on my mind, and I guess like I brought it up with you before, and you just kind of like told me briefly about it, but I have to ask, how did you land on the name Damned Avalon? I know Avalon was an island in Arthurian legends, but I imagine the Arthurian connection is pretty distant here.
Yeah, a little bit. The idea, it's more of the idea, it's not connected to the idea of King Arthur, but the concept of Avalon was definitely part of it. When I went to university, I went to York University, and I was in my second year when the big 3-month strike happened. And as a result, the courses, which would normally have ended in April, were extended into June. And as a result, we were there on campus for much more greenery and outdoorsiness than usually was. Usually when we leave, things are kind of like just coming back into bloom, And I had a friend then who, this guy said that he had found a cool spot, like a cool hangout spot. And he told us about this in the winter. And he said like, when things we can chill outside again, I'll show you where it is and all. And he kept going on about this. He kept going on about this place that he'd found, how cool it was. And I finally, in my sardonic manner, I finally said to him, all love intended, I kind of said, I was like, man, you're talking about this place like it's goddamn Avalon. And that kind of became the inner joke, where we called the place like goddamn Avalon after that. When I was putting together the collection, I'm not sure why I decided on that title for the collection, but I thought about it and it seemed to fit when I was reminded of it. And I think it was because it had the double meaning, where one, it could be like a casual, flippant way to refer to a paradise, goddamn Avalon, but it could also be like a more of an action verb, as in God has damned Avalon, in that way. And because my stories deal with, can work with some darker subject matter. The first story, has imagery of people have been trapped, people have been, are fearful. This guy who's sort of slightly physically maimed through his own kind of doing in the first story. There's it's not all like doom and gloom, but there definitely is that darker element to it, to some of the pieces. And I think that was what kind of influenced there. Then I started thinking about it more. And then I started thinking about the fact that, the people who I was with, the group of friends and people I was around when we were hanging out and discovered the place and heard about that, I don't talk to any of them anymore. And, and a lot of those people were part of and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here and say that everybody part of the group is bad. But the person who inspired the name, the guy I was telling you about, and the other friends that I was part of, we were also part of a club or a group at York. And I don't want to get too specific here. And the way things ended with those people was a little bit dramatic and not particularly pleasant. So also reflecting the fact that, I'm using a title, it's inspired by, people who I'm no longer around, or people I've moved past, or people that I've had to move past to be me. That also kind of maybe influenced the idea of, Damned Avalon as being an appropriate title.
Yeah, so kind of like a homage to moving on.
Yeah, I think that's almost a way of putting it. So it's not even the idea that it sounds like a very aggressive name, but it may not be necessarily negative. It could be that God has damned the Avalon because it needs to happen. Or like a forest fire, being not man-made, obviously, but like pre-human beings, pre-human contact, forest fires did happen to burn away and regrow.
So it was ordained.
Sorry.
So it was ordained.
Ah, fair enough. I'm not familiar with the term.
Yeah, it's just it's not exactly like a literary term. It's just like a quote from like something I read, like one of those fantasy novels. It's not like biblical or anything.
Yeah. So yeah, the that negative part may not be that darker part may not be negative. It may be the necessary darkness before the dawn. So I don't view it in a wholly cynical way.
Right on. Yeah. And the cover art for your book is also pretty interesting. The imagery is monochromatic and it features both photographs and illustrations. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, a couple of the photographs were from a publisher. The publisher, he had taken some photographs and he'd been in, I think, England, and they matched some of the work that I had there. So, like for example, one of the ones, I think, the Widening Maw, deals with like a church area. And one of my publisher one of the employees at the publishing house had some photographs, and because he was a publisher, we didn't have to then go secure rights and things like that. So he let me use them, give me permission. So a few of the photographs, like of stonework, are from the publisher, but all the rest of that stuff actually came from me. I did those drawings and I took those photos, and those initially were included included before we had decided on a cover design. So initially those were just going to accompany the pieces. Like for every story, we'll have one or two images of some kind. And some of those pieces of art were ones I'd already made and drawn and sketched, and other ones I made specifically for the book. And other photographs were from as I traveled. So, the ones like a hot air balloon in the desert, which accompanies like a desert story, those ones I had taken. And initially, yeah, so they were just initially compiled to accompany the stories. And then when we were looking at, putting the outside or the jacket together or the cover design, the designer, I forget the name, I apologize, but who had worked with the publisher had taken those designs and then arranged them into the covers. So no, it worked out really well. It came from me, but it's nice that the things that are on the cover are actually, reflective of the content and and come from, what accompanies the story. And also because it's a collection of fiction as opposed to a one unified novel, having that kind of almost like film strip look on the front, where like the little different boxes, the images and different stories arranged, it kind of seems to fit the essence of the book's identity.
It did give that impression, yeah.
Yeah.
So you also have visual art aspirations?
God, no. God, no. No, I like to draw, and I normally just throw them on my Instagram just for fun. And I do it sometimes on my own just because I like it. But I have no aspirations in it at all. Never been trained in it, don't have a lot of very good technique in it. And they're all very rough. But also it's because I don't have many aspirations in it that I sometimes do it. It's nice to work in something where, there's no aspiration. I'm not planning on doing this professionally. I have no ego in it. I have no hope for doing it professionally. I'm not looking to do it professionally. And that gives me a bit more, freedom there. Exactly. And it was really only when the publisher said like, hey, I've seen a few little sketches on your Instagram. Maybe you want to, throw them in with a thing, because some authors have done that, rough ones as well. And I thought to myself, okay, sure, I'll throw a couple in to accompany the stories. Why not? Not initially with the idea that they would go on the cover, but considering that it reflects the content and the identity, and these are from the book, and they have some connection to the themes and the topics. So I was like, okay, yeah, I think that works out really well. So it was very much of an accidental thing coming together. It's also because of the last two kind of like the collection of poetry I'd put out and stuff like that. In those cases, I'd worked with other artists to create the covers. So here it's kind of nice to have the book or the package or the product kind of be 100% me. Like I made the stuff on the cover mostly, and I wrote the book, and it's a bit more, unified in vision that way.
I can sympathize with that. So you used that on the cover, but when you used it on the cover, that the decision for some of the pieces to accompany the chapters or the flash fiction works, did that remain, or did that change since it was used on the cover?
No, that remained. So those aren't all of the images in the book, but some of the stories accompanying images are on the cover, and others are not on the cover, and you see them in the book.
Got it. Quite a story that is.
Yeah.
Moving back to poetry for a bit. So your term as Mississaugas Poet Laureate ends later this year, as you told me. How do you feel about that? Are you ready to say goodbye?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things that I've said to a lot of people in workshops and speaking engagements has been the level of excitement that I feel at the newer and the younger poets that are coming up right now, who are very, very exciting. So I think you definitely need that change in blood and energy, I think. And I think the young poets who are now coming to maturity to do it are very, very well equipped for that. Because the poets of today, the young poets of today particularly, are growing up in a culture that's far more saturated with poetry than I experienced growing up. I wrote poetry because in high school, because I was in a band, lyrics, things like that. That was about it. And a lot of people I know wrote it, but there wasn't a lot of, it wasn't like everywhere in the culture. I couldn't name like a lot of like current famous poets who are in pop culture at the household name recognition level, which you kind of get to more now. And also it's because we didn't have the mediums or the technology. Students now, like Instagram is launched poetry back into the fore to a level that has never been prior. And so students are now, they have the medium to write, to communicate, to see a lot of other poetry very quickly from around the world. And they also live in a world where if you had told me in 2005 that you would eventually be seeing poets giving readings on like The Tonight Show, back then it was Jay Leno, now it's Jimmy Fallon, I would have said, are you kidding me? No way. But now you have like Rudy Francisco from the United States, who's been on there, and Rupi Kaur has been on there. And just that visibility raises the possibility. And and that no, this is a thing. It's established. It's seen. It's recognized. It's not a weird like underground cult activity anymore. Like it's not like it ever was, but it's more present. And I find that students are not coming up in an atmosphere saturated in it, and I think that is nurturing a lot of growth that might not have been nurtured in previous years. And as a result, I think there's I see just amazing young poets. When I've seen, students have given readings in high school, or just young university age poets I've seen at other series. It's incredible. It's frightening, to see the level that they're at, because they have the resources. They have, YouTube. You can see the greatest spoken word artists working right now, very quickly. And it seems like a viable thing to do. And we've seen it done, and those barriers have been broken. So like for me, like it took a lot of practice and, and study to kind of get somewhat okay with doing spoken word and to do it somewhat competently. But I see students who are 18 now who are like, performing at a level of technical competency that it took me, 5 years to achieve. So because of the wealth of talent coming up now, I really think that it's exciting to see who will be coming up later. So I think it's something that I like it, I really like it, but I was always aware that it was a 2-year thing. That was it. And I also am feeling good about the pools of people who might be applying to do the next one. And I think they may have skills that I'm not everything. I have certain things I do well in other areas where I'm not as known or not as connected. And people who maybe will be better served maybe by having, you want a variety of people with a variety of skills, coming through. So I think it'll be better for the city and the community if you have if you change the blood every so often, That's like one of the things that, in Canada, slight rant on politics here, but like because we don't have term limits on our heads of state in the way that you have in other countries, we tend to have this Canadian habit of overstaying our welcome and then having everything swing on a hard pendulum. So it's like, Harper stays for like way too long, and then the reaction swings because people get, no matter how good or bad you are, after long enough time, people want change, and if you starve them of that for long enough, they swing really hard back. It's kind of like a pendulum. If I yank it all the way over here and let it go, it's going to go all the way over here. But if I, just adjust it every shorter time period, you might not get such hard extremes that you're swinging between. So I think that overstaying your welcome is the worst thing you could probably do there, and stagnate.
That sounds like something to contemplate. Can you give us a peek at any other creative projects you're looking at in the near future, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first off, the last book of like poetry that I had kind of put out was 2019, and I've been writing, obviously a lot more poetry between 2019 and now. So I've got about 45 pages of new ones. So soon-ish, I'll have a book of poetry that'll be ready to go that I can start sending out to places. And what's good is that over the last 2 years or so, a lot of those individual poems have been published in small journals. So when I eventually put the manuscript out, it'll be the case that 80 to 90% of it has been appeared in small journals, which I think gives it a stronger case when you're presenting it to like a full-on publisher. So that there will definitely be a book of poetry coming soon, or that I'll be sending out soon. I'm also working on again short stories. I spent the last year in kind of COVID writing a series of interconnected fantasy stories, which do take place in a common world. And I've done the writing on those, but now I got to go back and do the editing and the drafting and tighten it up and figure out order and eliminate any plot holes and things like that. So I got to do the cleaning up of it now. And the teaching this year has been kind of crazy. So hopefully when I get to summer, I'll have a bit more time to do the editing of that on that one, and also to dive back into it because it's kind of daunting. But so there's a book of fantasy work I'm writing on book of poetry that'll be coming up soon. Definitely hoping to, get back to doing more spoken word when things hopefully are opened up a little bit more and getting back into that. I've kept, rehearsing my stuff, trying not to, lose that, what I've memorized and not lose the technique over the time we've been shut down. And yeah, that's kind of some of the main stuff we're doing. Again, the Poet Laureate Public Works project will be that will be installed this summer. So while the creation is happening now, the installation will be coming up in the next couple months. So definitely keep an eye out for that, and I'll be posting about that as well. I believe we'll be having a virtual, opening for that, where I'll read some poems from it. The artist will talk about the designs, and we'll show some video of the trail and where you can find these things as well. And I am doing a recorded reading for Canada Day, that'll be played as well. Again, kind of like the last stretch of doing Poet Laureate stuff. And I often say this, and I never get around to it, but I would like to also perhaps write a bit more nonfiction about kind of the craft, because as I've done spoken word and put together some workshops for like the library, International Poetry Month, I've started to think about more like how would I teach what I do to other people. Like I teach English, the mechanics, but I mean like more on the creative side, the writing side, the submission side. That's a different kind of ballgame. So I would like to maybe do a bit more creative, a bit more nonfiction writing about ways that I practice or ways that I rehearse or things I've learned and things like that, and how to approach it, and just to look at it as more of a system, I think, or maybe looking at maybe taking a deeper dive into the craft through nonfiction. I think sort of like how if you read about, not to compare myself because God, I'm not on that level at all, but the Russian Konstantin Stanislavski, who is kind of the inventor of the method acting way of doing it. He started off as like a theater director and playwright, theater director, actor, but eventually he became much more enamored with like the craft, and a lot of his later half of the work was more about like delving into the craft and how can we do this better and how can we cultivate and train the next generation. So I wouldn't mind taking more of a deep dive into the craft of it as well through maybe some nonfiction writing. So that, yeah, the last few public works and public Poet Laureate projects are coming up. I have a few writing projects that I'll be submitting to publishers soon, and performing again, and perhaps writing a bit more nonfiction about the craft.
All right, then. I'll keep my eyes open, and I encourage anyone watching to do the same. Paul, is there anything you'd like to add for anyone out there who will be watching this?
No, just I'd encourage you to take a look over at my book at Mosaic Press on the website there and see about looking into a copy. It's available on early access right now. In mid-July, it'll be released more widely, and the price will go to the normal price. Right now, it's a discount early access as a kind of promotion in the lead up to the wider release. So I'd encourage people to check out that book on Mosaic Press's website. Also, I'm blanking on the name. Pat Connors and Stedman Party are two other writers who published their works with Mosaic Press, like with me. Like the three of us our books got taken on at the same time. So also please check out Stedman Party and Pat Connors, because their books are also out from Mosaic Press, also early access discount as well. So while you're over in Mosaic Press, take a look at Stedman Party and Pat Connors as well. And until I'll also be giving an open mic reading later this month at the Kwantlen Poetry Project, and they are based out of British Columbia. But with COVID online readings, I've been able to perform at their events, and they've been a wonderful community as well. So definitely check out while online readings are happening, I definitely do check out the Kwantlen, Kwantlen Poetry Project, and check out my book as well as other books on the website for Mosaic Press.
And that's a wrap. Thank you for joining me today, Paul, and I look forward to your next creative project. This was Paul Edward Costa, everybody, and his latest book is Damned Avalon, published by Mosaic Press. You can also get it through the Mosaic Press website. Thanks again, Paul.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care, everybody, and hopefully I'll be coming at you again with another exciting guest soon for another spectacular interview. Alfy out.